As a result of eased lockdowns and rapid deployment of both monetary and fiscal policy support, the world is coming back from the depths of its collapse in the peak of this crisis, which was the first half of this year. Employment levels have partially rebounded after having plummeted to historic lows. That said, this crisis is far from over. Employment remains well below pre-pandemic levels, and the labor market is increasingly polarized, with low-skilled workers, youth, and women being harder hit. The poor are also getting poorer, with up to 90 million people expected to fall into extreme poverty just this year. The ascent out of this calamitous great lockdown is likely to be long, uneven, and highly uncertain. It is therefore essential that fiscal and monetary policy support are not prematurely withdrawn as best possible. In our latest World Economic Outlook, we continue to project a deep recession in 2020. Global growth is projected to be minus 4.4%, which is a small upgrade from June. This upgrade owes to somewhat less dire outcomes in the second quarter, as well as signs of a stronger recovery in the third quarter, offset partially by downgrades in some emerging and developing economies. In 2021, growth is projected to rebound to 5.2%, slightly below our June projection. Now, except for China, where output is expected to exceed 2019 levels this year, output in both advanced economies and emerging and developing economies are projected to stay below 2019 levels well into 2021. Now, countries that rely heavily on contact-intensive services and oil exports face weaker recoveries compared to manufacturing-led economies. Now, the divergence in income prospects between advanced economies and emerging and developing economies, excluding China, triggered by this pandemic, is projected to worsen. We are upgrading our forecast for advanced economies for 2020 to minus 5.8%, followed by a rebound in growth to 3.9% in 2021. This is a partial recovery. For emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, instead we have a downgrade, with growth projected to be minus 5.7% in 2020 and then rebounding to 5% in 2021. Now, with this, the cumulative hit to per capita income for emerging and developing economies, excluding China, over this year and next is projected to be greater than that for advanced economies. Now, this crisis will leave scars well into the medium term as labor markets take time to heal, investment is held back by higher uncertainty and worsening balance sheets, and lost cooling impairs human capital. Now, after the rebound in growth in 2021, global growth is expected to gradually slow to about 3.5% in the medium term, which means that over the medium term, we have a projection of a permanent loss in output pretty much everywhere in the world. The cumulative loss in output, for instance, relative to the pre-pandemic projected path, will grow from 11 trillion over this year and next to 28 trillion by end 2025. Now, this represents a severe setback to improvements in average living standards pretty much everywhere in the world. Now, there remains tremendous uncertainty around the outlook. There are both downside risks and upside risks. The virus is resurging with localized lockdowns being reinstituted. Now, if this worsens and prospects for treatments and vaccines deteriorate, the toll on economic activity would be severe and likely amplified by severe financial market turmoil. Now, growing restrictions on trade and investment and rising geopolitical uncertainty could harm the recovery. Now, on the upside, faster and better news on treatments and vaccines or further policy stimulus can significantly improve the outlook. Now, Considerable policy support has already been put in, fiscal support of up to 12 trillion, many actions by central banks around the world, and that has helped to save lives and livelihoods and prevented a financial catastrophe. However, there is still much that needs to be done to ensure a sustained recovery. First, greater international collaboration is needed to end this health crisis. Tremendous progress is being made in developing tests, treatments, and vaccines, but only if countries work closely together will there be enough production and widespread distribution to every part of the world to end this pandemic. Now, we estimate that if medical solutions can be made available faster and more widely relative to our current baseline, it could lead to a cumulative increase in global income of almost $9 trillion by end 2025, benefiting all economies and reducing divergence. Second, to the extent possible, policies must focus aggressively on limiting persistent economic damage from this crisis. Governments should continue to provide income support to households and work to preventing rising bankruptcies and job destruction through supporting vulnerable but viable firms. Now, over time, as the recovery strengthens, policies should shift to facilitating a reallocation of resources towards sectors that are growing, like e-commerce, away from sectors that are shrinking. A public green infrastructure investment push in times of low interest rates and high uncertainty can significantly increase jobs and accelerate the recovery, while also serving as an initial important step towards reducing carbon emissions. Now, emerging markets and developing economies are having to deal with this crisis with far fewer resources. Now, these economies will need to prioritize critical spending for health and support for the poor, and also ensure maximum efficiency. But they will also need continued support in the form of international grants, concessional aid, and in several cases, debt relief. Now, where debt is unsustainable, it should be restructured sooner than later to free up finances to deal with this crisis. Lastly, policies should be designed with an eye to placing economies on paths of stronger, equitable, and sustainable growth. The global easing of monetary policy, while essential for the recovery, should be complemented with measures to prevent build-up of financial risks over the medium term. Fiscal spending and output collapse have driven sovereign debt levels to a record 100% of global GDP. Now, while low interest rates, along with the projected rebound in growth in 2021, will stabilize debt for many countries, it will help all countries to have a medium-term fiscal framework to give confidence that debt remains sustainable. Investments in health, digital infrastructure, and green infrastructure and education can help achieve productive, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Now, this is the worst crisis since the Great Depression, and it will take significant innovation on the policy front at both at the national level and at the international level to recover from this great lockdown. The challenges are daunting, but there are reasons to be hopeful. The exceptional policy response, including the establishment of the European Union Recovery Fund and the use of digital technologies to provide social assistance, are powerful reminders that well-designed policies protect people and collective economic well-being. At the IMF, we have provided funding at record speed to 81 members since the start of the pandemic. We've granted debt relief. We've called for extended debt service suspension for low-income countries and for the reform of the international debt architecture. Building on these actions, policies for the next stage of the crisis must seek lasting improvements in the global economy that creates prosperous futures for all.